This video is going to show how to create a slab mug from a rectangular pattern and with a flat bottom. Now, I'm going to show 3 variations of this. So in addition to the straight-sided, straight-bottomed one, I'm also going to show a mug that has a belly to it. So it was the same form that I bellied with a flat bottom, and then this one, which is also bellied, and I have arched the bottom by pushing it out on the inside, and I added a foot ring. All of these are made from a basic cylinder, and you can expand beyond this to any sort of cylindrical form, like a bowl, pitcher, things like that. Here is an example of a finished couple of versions where I bellied it out. Just to give you an idea, this pattern has shrunk. You can kind of see the shrink rate. It's quite a bit. This is about a 14% shrink rate with this clay body that I'm using. Let's set this aside and we'll get started. You can use any clay for making slab mugs. This clay that I'm using, this is all scrap clay that my students had used in the past, and my trick that I tell them is keep those scraps really loose, squirt them down, and then when you wedge it together, it will reabsorb the moisture. So every time they roll out slabs, I have them keep those slabs loose, and then they squirt them down, and then they can re-roll. So I am using a template that I have some pre-made templates at school. You just want to make sure that it is even, that it's not, you know, all wonky and everything, and that the ends are going to match up when they meet. You can make it whatever size you want to for a template. I will put that in the video description, but one consideration is having it wide enough so you can actually fit your hand in there so you can clean it. Say for instance on this one is just a little too narrow to actually fit my hand in there, so it's much more difficult to work with. So I'm going to take my wedged clay, I'm going to roll it out, and I'm going to use the hardwood slab sticks. Now in my classroom, I have them color coordinated. For a mug, I'm going to use the 1/4 inch thick slab sticks, and when you are rolling, you need to be aware of rolling in multiple directions. So as I roll a little bit in one direction, I'm going to flip it or rotate it, roll in another direction. Now, obviously, I need a long, skinny piece of clay, but you don't want to just solely do everything in only one direction because you want to have more of an even compression of your particles. I usually have the kids, if they're working on sets of things, they could roll out a piece of clay big enough to cut 2 of these rectangles out of at one time. It helps them go a little bit faster. Okay, so let's just check the length. We'll see, I'm getting pretty close there. So as I roll, I might just rotate it a little bit to kind of stretch it on the diagonal perhaps a little bit as well. Okay, notice that I keep lifting it from the surface, and I'm working on a canvas surface. It's very difficult to work with slabs on a surface where it gets stuck, and canvas has the advantage of being porous, so it absorbs a little bit of water, so it does release. Now, you know that you're down to the thickness when you can hear the pin on either side. I will then set these to the side now. And the next step that I will do is I take a rib and I will compress the surface. This is one of the mud tool ribs. I will put the link in the video description. You will find a Google Doc in the video description that I have of some of my favorite and recommended tools for things that are either Amazon links or some other non-Amazon links of things that aren't on Amazon. I like to rib both sides. The ribbing does two things. First of all, it smooths it, but that's really not the most important thing. The most important thing is that it's compressing it and it makes it stronger. If you wanted a really smooth surface, you could just work on smoother canvas, or say like a bed sheet that produces a really nice smooth surface. So obviously I have a lot more clay than I needed for this, but obviously my template will meet just fine. Now, you can use different items to texture clay. I'm going to just use the one that I used in this video, which is a roller. For my students, when we're doing our textured slab project, you can use any of the things that I have, whether it's rollers, texture mats, different things that I might have in my texture drawers. But this little roller is a great little roller. If your clay is a little on the wet side, which mine is not, mine's pretty good, but I just wanted to show you this as an option. You could take a little bit of cornstarch, kind of lightly dust some cornstarch. So it's kind of acting like, say, flour with pie crust, and this is just, you know, regular old cornstarch that you buy at the grocery. It will add just a little bit of a dryness, so when you roll, you don't end up by getting stickage. So I try to roll smoothly as I'm doing this. I kind of keep my hands moving as I'm rolling it. And then I'm going to roll one more section so I have a piece for the bottom. Okay, I'm going to release that again. Now this long strip is going to be where I'm going to make the mug. And the MKM, they do have a cool roller board that I want to try out. I'll do another video when I get one of those to show you how those work. But they're kind of cool. It's designed to help you roll a consistent pressure on your roller. All right. Okay, so I've got that cut out. And I should have said I used a needle tool when I did that. And I'm just going to set the other piece aside. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, whenever you make a cylinder, okay, when you bring those edges together, you want to be aware that an end, a joint like this, a butt end, is never as strong a joint as a bevel if they overlap. This little example, it's just some wood that has been cut on a bevel. This shows you what can happen when your ends come together and you bevel them. They would overlap like that, and it's an easier seam to put together, okay? Whereas if you had the butt joint like this, that's just much harder to blend without it blowing apart. So to put a bevel on this, you can easily take a knife, okay? And if you are doing it with a knife, you want to hold the knife at the same angle when you cut the opposite end. So if I cut at this angle here, I'm going to be taking off the top, and if I cut at the same angle down here, I'm going to be taking off a little bit of an undercut underneath there. I do have another tool that I'll show you, though, that makes it a little bit easier. And true confessions, I wasn't really paying that closely attention since I was talking. I probably should have lined this up just a little bit more skewed, so my pattern's just a wee bit off, but for the demonstration, I think that's okay. Now, before I make it to the cylinder, I'm going to think about the upper edge and smoothing it. Whenever you have a cup and you're going to put your mouth on the rim, you really don't want texture because that feels awkward when you're drinking out of it. So I'm taking a rib and just smoothing a little bit on this upper rim. I am going to be trimming that edge again. I could have avoided doing the texture altogether, but I wanted to show you this because sometimes you can't avoid it. So I wanted to show you how you could do that. All right, so I have smoothed it, but it did also make my edge quite thin, which isn't altogether bad because I did want to thin my edge a little bit anyhow. So I'm just going to line this up, and then you can use a needle tool or a knife. Just recut your edge to make sure it looks nice and clean. And I just trimmed a little bit off on that side there. Okay, now I'm a rectangle again. So next step is I'm going to bevel the ends. I can either do it with a knife, or I want to show you this cool little tool. I have a few of these for my classroom. I wish I knew really how to pronounce this. I'm assuming it might be Zyam, but I'm not really sure. These tools are super cool. This is a bevel cutter, and it has two different angles. I think this one is a 45, and I'm not exactly sure what that one is right there. Maybe a 60? I don't know. But I'm going to use this one to do my bevel. So the way that you do it is you line up the wood edge with the edge of the clay, and you just kind of draw that across. And I kind of hold this end right here as the wire gets to the end to make sure that I don't stretch it and make it all funky there. Now, to do the other one, remember it has to be the same angle. I'm going to flip this over and do the other side. It's easier to flip a knife. You can't really flip this cutter, so instead I have to flip the clay. All right, now that I have both ends beveled, I'm ready to make it into a cylinder. You want to score the ends, and I know that sometimes some people will say, if it's really wet clay, you don't need to score. You can go ahead and just press it together. For my students, I want you to take the extra effort of scoring because I just want to make sure that you have a good enough craft that you're not going to have cracking. Then I'm going to slip. I like to use a little bit of water. You could use prepared slip if you want to, and I'm only slipping one end. Then I carefully pick it up, kind of supporting it all the way around, and then if you can see, I'm overlapping the bevel. Okay, I'll hold this up so you can kind of see, you can see how it's angled there, and I'm overlapping it, and then I gently press it. Now, when I work with textured slabs like this, I usually don't try to blend the outside because I like to show off the fact that it is a textured slab. So I do blend the inside because I like to make sure that it's nice and watertight. You can use whatever tool you want. Say for instance, you could use, I really like this Kemper tool, this wood tool. I think it's WT12. My former colleague, Mrs. Valentine, used to tell her students it was the Wenzel because I always call it the wooden tool that looks like a pencil. This one, there are wooden knives of different sizes. Some of my students have shorter ones in their bins. I'm just using this one because I happen to have it handy. So I'm totally blending. I'm going to flip that the other direction too, making sure that the seam on the interior is completely blended. So hopefully you can kind of see that that is completely blended down in there. Okay, now remember that one side is the top, one side is the bottom. It looks like I have just a little ding right there. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of water and compress over that. If you have a little fault like that, you want to try to fix it before it continues to dry. Okay, now I'm going to flip it upside down. Okay, and there are two different ways you could go about making the bottom. You could say take that extra clay, which is what I'm going to use. I'm going to use that extra textured clay that I have, and I could say take it, make sure it's circular, set it on top, cut it out, and then I would have a size that matches. You know what? It would be silly if I did it like this. I meant to flip the texture over so the texture is on the back side. My mistake. So I could, again, put it on there. I could cut it out and then attach it. Instead of that, I am going to use, I have a little pattern here, okay? Depending on exactly how big you want to make it. Do you want to make it the exact size? Do you want to make it a little bit bigger. Well, I want to make mine just a wee bit bigger. So I'm going to take my pattern, I'm going to trim this out, and I'm trimming it out of the center because that's where my texture was on the opposite side. I could have turned it over to cut it out, but okay. So there we go. There's my texture. Now I'm going to turn this upside down, and I'm going to turn this, technically that's right side up now, and I'm going to prep both the surfaces by scoring. Okay, I've scored the top of the bottom and the bottom of the side. I've also scored a little bit more toward the inside and just down a little bit on the inside edge of the wall, because I will be adding a coil to this. Now, sometimes I know many artists who will work and they don't put a coil on the inside, and that is perfectly fine. If you know you're good enough that your joint is going to be fine, you don't need a coil. For my beginning students, I definitely recommend a coil. Now, I do want to put a really nice amount of scoring and a nice amount of slip on this because I really want this to be well anchored. So I did slip both pieces. I want to make sure this looks very round. And then I position it on top of the circular base that I cut out. Okay, now you might see that my edge is sticking out just a little bit, and I am okay with that. Okay, I'm going to do something with it in a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to gently tap it. And now I am going to do one other thing to get this to anchor on a little bit more. I'm going to use a little pony roller, and I'm pressing down right above where the wall is to really anchor that. Okay, and then there are different ways that you can address this. Like, I'm just going to kind of taper this, kind of bevel it up a little bit. You don't have to do it. This is just like a little aesthetic thing. I'll kind of fix that up in a little bit there, but that helps to anchor it. So I know that that wall is fairly anchored. Now I'm going to secure the wall by adding a coil. When I add an interior coil to something like this, I usually make it about pencil thick. Okay. All right. And once you've rolled your coil, you want to go ahead and score. Again, this may be overkill for a lot of people. I'm making this a little extra secure for my students who are beginners. Okay. Yep, that's enough. And then I'm going to add some slip or just some water, which creates slip. And then I'm going to position this down in there. Let me position it and then I'll show you. My coil broke and I'm adding a little section right there. All right, so hopefully you can see the coil down in the base of the seam in the corner. So now I'm going to take a tool and blend the coil into the bottom as well as up into the side. Use whatever tool you like, but I really do like the hooked end of this wooden knife tool. It's very handy. Again, link will be in the video description for all of these. Now I have the coil blended and I'm just going to smooth it a little bit. Coil is blended. Now let's talk about how we could address the bottom here. You could quite simply just take the bottom and kind of smooth it like this, okay? You could trim away a little bit of the excess, but I kind of like the fact that the bottom shows the fact that it's a slab, and it's not that much that's sticking out. It's just a little proud piece of it. Let me get this off my hands. Okay, now there is a trick that, let's say hypothetically, I just want it straight like this. There is a trick that you can use to try to keep it round. You could use something like a solo cup, except this is a little bit short. Maybe I need a fatter cup. Or I like to have a nice really round funnel that's handy, and then if you just gently press it, it'll help you to get it nice and truly round. So you want to make sure it's nice and truly round prior to it getting leather hard. Now right in here too, if you have any spots where it kind of sags in, you want to make sure that those spots are looking pretty good and even. I can use a turntable perhaps. Using a turntable and kind of looking at it from the side definitely helps that aspect. Helps you to get it a little bit more even. All right. Now, this is a fine start for a cylinder cup, but I wanted to show you a couple other options on how you could take and transform this into, say, something like this. Okay, and for that, I've got a couple more pieces. Okay, so this cup has a bottom somewhat similar to this, except I actually kind of trimmed a little bit extra off. I took my knife and I trimmed a little bit extra off. So whereas this has a little bit more clay down here, this I trimmed some of it away. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so there are different ways that you can address it. But now, if I wanted to, say, expand this and make it be a little bit more rounded, what you can do is I usually hold the top and bottom, and I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to balloon this out a little bit like this. Okay. And then when you get to the seam over here, you just have to be gentle. You don't want to pop through the seam. You want to kind of stretch on either side of the seam. There we go. And occasionally you'll get a little bit of surface cracking. That happens when you do this, because if you have a really nice textured surface and then you stretch it, some of that texture might crack a little bit. And I think it's kind of cool sometimes though, if you are glazing it with a great texture showing glaze, it kind of shows up, and I think that's all right. If I had some air bubbles in there, of course I could always fix those a little bit with a little paintbrush, which I'll do that in a minute. Now right here, where I've been stretching this seam, I want to maybe take a little bit of a paintbrush, kind of come in here, clean that up a little bit. Okay. Now on the rim, if I want to do just a straight rim that's kind of angling up, that is totally fine. But I want to show you how you could take and perhaps flex the rim out. So I hold my hand and I'm just kind of stabilizing the rim so I can flex it out right above my hand. Now this is all done while it's still plastic, in the plastic stage. Okay, and you want to be careful. You don't want to go too far with an angle. This is really the limit. I would not go any farther than this with the angle of the rim, because if it angles out too much and it's a drinking cup, it gets super awkward. and you can spill it on yourself. Okay, so that has a little bit more of a chubby belly, and I just want to look at it and make sure it looks relatively even. Okay. Now, this will stand to reason, but when you have a straight cylindrical one versus one with a belly, the one with the belly will contain a lot more liquid. Okay, and then this is ready to get leather hard. Of course, when you put it on a board, again, make sure that it's nice and round, because since I stretched it, it's no longer that round. Okay, the other way that you could address a bonham that I wanted to show you, this one was a little bit bigger and it was standing out just a little bit more proud. You could kind of roll it a little bit on the table, and that kind of rolls it up. That's a completely different look that you can have. Now, for the one that had the rolled bottom, I wanted to show you the third option for a straight cylindrical cup, and that is curving the bottom out and putting a foot ring on it. So this one, I've already made the belly like I did on the previous one, and then for the bottom, I'm going to use my fingers on the inside, and I'm going to gently and slowly stretch the bottom. The clay that we're using is grogged, so I'm not really inclined to use a sponge, because if I did, I would really be removing the tiny particles and leaving behind bigger particles. That's all gritty and groggy. So instead, I'm just using my fingers to stretch. Down here, I just have a little place that I need to blend. There we go. All right. Okay. So with this now rounded, okay, now I can take and make a foot ring, see, like I did on this one. And for that, I'll just take some of my scrap clay that I had left over. I'm going to take my scrap clay and just make sure I have a nicely textured piece. I often have little foot ring templates in my classroom, but I'll show you how you can make it without a template as well. Depending on how tall you want it, okay, I'm just going to make this as thick as the slab sticks. And then there's my foot ring. Should be of a pretty even thickness. Okay, and again, since I'm making this from a slab, I want to make sure that I'm actually cutting the ends at a bevel where it's going to go together. So you can think about how big do you want your foot ring. I'm going to make it just a little shorter. Now, we could use the bevel cutter like I did before, or I'll just show you how you could cut this easily with a knife. If you overlap them like that, you can cut them both at the same time, and it's the same angle, and it's the right length. I'm going to score the ends, add a little bit of water and slip, overlap the bevels, blend the inside of that wall. Now when you go to attach this, okay, my wall is already angled, so it is kind of nice to take this upper edge, which is flat, and just gently angle it. So if I'm taking the interior edge and kind of angling it downward. So I'm holding my rib at an angle to slant it. So it's going to hopefully match the contour a wee bit more. Okay. So that contour matches a little bit more now. Okay, now I recommend when you place a foot ring on that you stand up and you look straight down on it and you make sure that it looks centered. Like when you put it on a wheel, that it looks centered from up above. And also look at it side to side and make sure that it looks even, which that does. Then I'll mark it on the interior. And I'm going to take this off. If you have time to wait, it's kind of handy if you just allow this to stiffen up a little bit. But with my students, usually they don't have time. You know, with the shortened class bells that we have, they have to get done whatever they can in the class time that we have. So I'm going to score the bottom of the cup. I'm going to score the bottom edge of the foot, which has the slight bevel. I'm going to score the interior edge of the foot as well, because I'm going to be adding another little coil. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you do wait to put a foot on, you want to make sure that the foot is the same exact moisture as the cup itself. Now, one thing to keep in mind is here's my seam. I want to line my seam up of the cup with the foot, okay? And then, again, if this were just a little bit firmer, a little bit closer to leatherhard, it would be a little easier to do this. So I'm just going to kind of press this on. I'm going to make sure that it's looking even as it sits. Okay. All right. Now the interior, as I said, I am going to make a small coil. Coil is blended to the side of the foot, and then I will take and blend it to the bottom of the cup. And then turn this tool sideways, get rid of some of my tool marks. Okay. Now, if this moved at all, I do want to make sure that it's not caved in. Okay. And then the last thing that you may want to do is you could flex that foot ring if you want to give it a little bit of an angle. Once it's attached, I sometimes just flex it a little bit. Okay. There we go. These loose scraps are the scraps that I had talked about earlier, that while they're still in that plastic stage, you just want to spritz them down a little bit, put them back in your clay bag so they can reabsorb that moisture, and they'll be good for the next person to roll slabs. Now on the day that you make a cup form and it's very plastic, I would go ahead and make a handle as well. The handle is not going to be attached until both the handle and the cup form are leather hard, but if you can go ahead and make them, then you know you can dry them together and they should be ready to attach at the same time. So when I show my kids how to make handles, I start off by making a tapered coil that kind of resembles a carrot. This is a technique that I picked up several years ago from Sandi Pierantozzi. She always referred to it as the carrot slam, and I still call it that way with my kids because it's a great descriptor. So I'm going to make more handles than I need because typically your first couple handles might not come out well. So if I'm making 3 cups, I would probably make 5 to 6 handles. The way that I do this is I would take this coil now, and I'm going to smack it down or slam it down onto the canvas, lift it up. Now normally I would use a sponge and wet this and stretch it, but because I want to texture this, and this clay is fairly plastic, I am just going to use my finger to shape this. So it's flat and it's tapered, it's skinnier here, okay? Then I'm going to roll it to get a great little texture on it, okay? And then depending on what your shape is, you're going to arch it around so it's going to fit your mug. So this one would be cut off about like there. That would probably be like a 2-fingered handle, maybe something similar to this, okay? And this has a little addition. I'll show you that later, okay? So for my students, we will store the handles kind of stuck onto a tray, and then you're going to put your cup with it and cover it with plastic. This one, I'm going to do a little neatness, like right there, it bumps out. I'm just going to tap it down to make it a little bit more even. Okay, now for this one, I'm going to actually bend it in the opposite direction. I'm going to take the small end and bend it. So this is a different look, another possibility that you have for a handle. So that would be more similar to this one. I use the skinny end on the top up there. For this last one, I'm actually going to hook it around so it will kind of form more of a loop, and I'll be trimming it off, but I wanted a different shape with it. Now, for my students to get these leather hard, usually you will keep your handle and cups together on the same tray. You can certainly put a dry fabric towel over them if you would want, and then I recommend that you cover it with a bag to help make sure that they don't dry out too much. You definitely always have to cover your handles. Occasionally I have people who forget to cover their handles and they come in the next day and they're way too dry to use. Okay, this cup is leather hard that I made yesterday, so it's holding its form quite nicely. The handle has dried along with the cup, so they both are equal in moisture and they are ready to attach. Now, a handle, when you make it, usually will have extra clay on it, or at least when you make it in this manner. It has a lot of extra clay, which I would trim off. Obviously, I would not be attaching it like this. That would be an outrageously big handle. A handle should have enough room to get the fingers in that you intend to without a ton of extra space. Now, I'm going to choose to put my handle directly on the seam, and that does help to hide any imperfections that perhaps I might have. Now, when I determine how big I want the handle to be, I often hold it up behind the cup so I can kind of get a sense of angles and depth. And then when I have a handle, size that looks pretty good to me, I usually mark it. So I'm gonna just hold that up behind it with my markings, and I kind of like the way that that one looks. So now when I cut the handle, I want to make sure that I'm cutting it evenly when I cut it across. Okay, so this one is not cut even. So if you can see that, you can see it's crooked. If you cut it crooked and you put it on crooked, it's going to lean to one side. So I'm going to just trim this a little bit more. And I also often will round it a little bit. I round it to get it to match the contour of the cup, since the cup wall is round. Same with down here. I make sure that it looks even, so it's not tilted. And then I'll place it. I'm going to trim just a little bit more off of this. I'm going to trim up at the top. It's a little trial and error to get it the right size that you like. All right. I think I like that size. Now, when attaching, I'm going to mark the placement. I'm just marking it with a needle tool. Whatever you choose to use, whatever you like the best is fine. So when I have marked that, now I'm going to take some sort of tool and score where the handle is going to go. And I usually overscore it just a little bit. I have a little more scoring than really needed. Okay, so I have both the cup and the handle are scored. I'm going to add some water, which of course is creating slip. And I'm just going to run my scoring tool one more time. There we go. Okay. Now with my hand on the inside, I'm going to push that handle in place at the top and the bottom. Okay. Now, when you look at the angle of this, this angle does sweep down a little bit right here, and it sweeps down right here. So a lot of times what I do like to do is get in there and just gently blend underneath there. I'm going to blend it. Okay. Then maybe just a teensy bit down here. I'm going to do that. Because this is a textured slab, I'm not adding the coils that I often do on some of my handles. I often add a little coil up at the top of the handle on the top and the top on the bottom, so like the inside there. I often add a little coil that I can blend, but because this is, again, textured slab, I don't want to do that because I don't want to compete with my texture or damage any of my texture. Okay. So now I want to think about the contour. Yeah. All right, so as I look at this, I'm going to watch this contour right here, and if I have a couple of fingers in there, it kind of pinches. So what I'm going to do is push this out at the bottom a little bit, and I push that side in. So I just kind of reshaped the form so I can get my fingers in there a bit more comfortably. And then I'm just tidying up with a paintbrush. Make sure that any little seam is completely sealed with slip. Okay. If you wanted to, say, add a thumb rest or a pinky rest, you could certainly do that. So like down here, if I want to add a pinky rest, I'm going to make a bean, and I will pinch it. And I can add that on. So I'm going to put it down near the bottom where the pinky would be. And again, I'm not going to do a lot of blending with that, since it is a textured handle there. I'll just kind of take my paintbrush over it. But then, as I'm drinking, I can hold it with that little rest. I might even push it down a little bit more. So that is the application of a handle. One of the other things that I want to do is I'm going to just tidy up the interior. I like to use a paintbrush. That way, if you have any tool marks down in there, you are going over them. I cannot use a sponge with this particular clay because this clay is very grogged, and if I sponge, I will leave a very groggy surface behind. There we go. I'll go ahead and I will put the other handles on, the other two cups, a little bit more quickly without the dialogue so much, and I'll show you how those go. And now this step I am showing how I smooth the upper rim by dipping my fingers in water, smoothing over those sharp corners really. Here I'm placing the next handle on. This is the one where it's a little bit smaller at the top and a little fatter at the bottom, but the placement and the attachment is very similar to the other one. And then I will also be rounding the rim, cleaning the inside with a paintbrush, using the funnel to make sure it's round. Now this particular handle is the one that's more shaped like a loop, where it sweeps up at the bottom, so it's rather loop shaped. I'm going to show a little frozen section here of it so you can see how it sweeps down at the top and it sweeps up at the bottom. And that's how to make 3 variations of a slab cylinder mug with 3 handles.